Thank you so much. Thank you to the librarians and the committee that have organized this campus conversation. And thank you to all of you for being here. I know April is a really difficult time in the sense that there's lots of talks and lots of things scheduled. I tried to be more humane and schedule this talk for February, but then we had a snowstorm. So I appreciate your being here. But it's actually a good time to talk about this topic as it is spring, and at least culturally, thinking about cleaning up in the springtime is often when we think about it. So I wanted to start by admitting, and the original title, the shift was only, it's all on me, not on Trudy, for being unprepared. It did have the title, The Unexpected History, I think, of, what was it originally?
It was Finding Nature in Unexpected
That's
Places,
right.
What Cleaning Closets and Laundry Rooms Tell Us About American History.
Yeah, so finding nature in unexpected places. And I wanted to acknowledge from the start that the cleaning closet is, admittedly, a seemingly strange place to set as a launching point for an environmental history. After all, cleaning up is, in many ways, an effort to draw a starker line between inside and outside spaces. If you think about the tasks of cleaning a home or an office, they include wiping away muddy footprints from the rug or carrying out trash to be disposed of elsewhere, what seemed to create a starker line between inside and outside culture and nature. But what I hope to accomplish today in my talk is to help you see how our indoor actions of cleaning up are and were actually embedded in broader ecological relationships, demonstrating the ways in which the history of and technologies and practices of cleaning have shaped natural spaces like forests and rivers. And so these connections between indoor work and outside spaces probably would have been easier for you to imagine were we here 100 years ago, when the laundry room was as often or not as not the great outdoors, and when the laundry was not the fresh air scented laundry was not something that was obtained from a bottle or a dryer sheet, but from sun and wind. And well into the 1950s, many women doing laundry still trekked between inside and outside spaces, hauling water from outdoor pumps into kitchens, and then lugging wet garments outside before returning with dry clothes to iron and fold. There's more pictures than really are merited for this point, but I just couldn't decide which to cut. So. By the 1960s, awareness of these environmental dimensions of cleaning up waned as new technologies cut off engagement with nature that was once part of cleaning tasks. Technologies meant household workers were more likely to push a button than to hang clothes outdoors, or to purchase a lavender-scented synthetic chemical cleanser than to grow lavender plants themselves. But these new technologies were every bit as reliant on natural resources in the form of fossil fuels, pulp, or land to absorb waste. And historians have long appreciated how the adoption of new technologies for household labor reduced the number of hired household workers while enlarging the task of household work for women in the home. But what has been less fully explained is the ways that an ever-enlarging environmental footprint accompanied the adoption of these technologies. Ever-heightening standards of cleanliness did not simply demand, in historian Ruth Schwartz Cowan's classic phrasing, more work for mother, but also required more work from nature. And indeed, over the course of the 20th century, as cleaning technologies have become more efficient in time and labor, they have intensified environmental effects. Ironically, the act of cleaning up leaves behind lots of dirty, sullied messes. So to give you a sense of what I mean in more concrete terms of this connection between indoor and outdoor space, I'm going to spend most of my time today walking you through the development of two technologies that cleaned up messes in the 20th century US. First, pine oil disinfectants. I'm just trying to turn on a timer here so I can see when and if I'm going over. Pine oil disinfectants like Pine Sol, which originated in the 1910s, and disposable diapers, which, while present by the 1930s, were only widely adopted in the 1970s. And I'm hoping that the stories of these two products should give you a sense of the shifting environmental footprint of household work, but also reveal the complex array of social, cultural, and material forces that drive environmental change. So first, let's start with a product that perhaps as you're doing your spring cleaning, you have opened your cleaning closet to find, a disinfectant or sanitizing agent. And the heightened awareness of the need to sanitize or disinfect working spaces was one that intensified during the Progressive Era, as Americans became increasingly aware that microscopic germs, not fermenting miasmas, were the cause of disease. as what historian Nancy Tomes calls the gospel of germs took root, disinfectants multiplied. But house cleaners, janitors, and public health officials, eventually I get to this slide, found existing preparations problematic in two ways. One was as they investigated a lot of these household cleaners that were billed as disinfectants, they found that very few of them actually eradicated the very disease germs they were being applied to eradicate. So there were actually efforts almost akin to the Pure Foods Act in the early 20th century about clear labeling, about ensuring that particular disinfectants actually readily worked. But the other problem with many of the agents that were used for cleaning in the early 20th century, things like carbolic acid or sulfur dioxide, was just plain that they stank. Milton Rosenow, a public health official, himself one of the proponents of the new ideas of germ theory, a public health agent, noted that although these disinfectants were effective, they carried a vile odor. So one of the selling points of good disinfectants were those that were promised to be odorless. Platts chloride, for instance, described its products as an odorless, colorless liquid. Virofirm germicides label promised users it does not have the repulsive odor of many disinfectants. And it was within this context that a new product emerged that satisfied both laboratory scientists and the sniff test: pine oil. A byproduct of the wood turpentine industry, pine oil paired germicidal powers that satisfied public health experts with an inoffensive, even pleasing odor. In 1915, Albert Stevenson, a sanitary chemist with the United States Public Health Service, called it an efficient liquid disinfectant, and laboratory tests demonstrated it eliminated typhoid germs. And for Stevenson, the product's low cost and effectiveness were key, but its odor was not insignificant. Pine oil, Stevenson wrote, has a much more pleasing odor than coal tar compounds and can be used where these products, on account of their odor, are not practical. But the other story that I want to introduce you to is the fact that the whole emergence of a pine oil disinfectant had as much to do with circumstances of production as it did with these concerns about public health. For in pine oil, Southern industrialists saw a solution to one of the most pressing political, social, and economic problems facing the United States South at that time. And that problem was this: deforested acres, many of them in the South. Pine oil was the answer to how to transform cut-over regions in the American South, because the same old and oil-rich stumps that yielded most pine oil had especially long roots that were especially tenacious. Whereas softwood stumps decayed over time, longleaf pine stumps, the kind that had forested most of the United States South, did not. And this stumpy land was hard to use for other purposes. The cost of extraction made it not worthwhile to turn it into more profitable agricultural land. Many would-be cultivators found the expense and labor of clearing the stumps too expensive to even merit the effort. And so pine oil was extracted from these resinous stumps and limbs of dead and downed longleaf pines. The older the stump, the more resinous the residues inside it. Left to dry and cure, the resinous lightwood oxidized and yielded more oils. Now, here enter one of the most fascinating parts of this story, is that the largest producer of pine oil, Hercules Powder Company, did not set out to be a manufacturer of pine oil at all. You might guess from its name, Hercules Powder Company was a manufacturer of dynamite. And they saw in these acres an opportunity to boost their profits, because dynamite, since they were so difficult to extract, was the way that people would clear these stumps from the ground. And so the prime method of removing stumps was a way that the company could sell dynamite to prospective landowners. And so in 1918, in the interest of reclamation of these pine lands for agriculture, the United States Department of Agriculture approached the Hercules Company, urging it to help them determine if the manufacture of distilled pine oil from stumps might reasonably help recoup the losses of land clearing. So in October of 1918, Hercules established an experiment station in Gulfport, Mississippi, to determine the best methods for wood distillation of pine oil and the costs and profits involved in its manufacture. And the company was plain that profit motives more than altruistic motives was behind their efforts. We have full confidence that we will be repaid in the sale of dynamite and blasting supplies by placing our knowledge on this subject at the disposal of those who contemplate land clearing. And This idea took off not simply because of the backing of the USDA, not simply because there was a big supply of these stumps that need to be cleared, but also compared to the other methods, and I'll come back to this slide in a moment. Got a little bit out of order here. Compared to the other method of acquiring turpentine from live trees, the process of extracting wood turpentine from downstream trees seemed especially attractive to those in the progressive era who were seeking to turn waste into some sort of marketable product. The manufacture of wood turpentine, two chemists advanced in 1914, will become far-reaching of importance in the future. As they explain, wood turpentine manufacture turned a waste product into a profitable commodity and made cut-over lands fit for agricultural production. And compared to gum turpentine production, pictured on the top right there, which relied on hand labor and as practiced in the 1910s and 20s weakened trees and made stands especially susceptible to insect infestation and fire, these highly capitalized steam and solvent extracting wood turpentine plants seemed a more modern and progressive kind of way to attack this problem. The same cord of longleaf pine that yielded nearly 9 gallons of wood turpentine provided about 3 gallons of pine oil. And by the early 1920s, about 10 large pine oil steam and solvent plants were operating through the South, the largest of which were owned by Hercules Powder. Now, as southern forests and gum turpentine stands shrank, pine oil production grew. Research on the disinfectant powers of pine oil boosted its sales. By 1922, one chemist identified at least 5 readily available disinfectants made in the United States that contained pine oil. I won't go through all of their names. Epinol, Pinetol, some of them are manufactured by Eli Lilly, William Merrill Company, so big chemical concerns are involved in this business. Pine Sol, since it's probably the one that you may have heard of, originated in Jackson, Mississippi in 1929, and to my sorrow, I haven't been able to find much other than the company's website about its history, although I continue to look. Disinfectant manufacturers were just one of the markets for pine oil. It was used by makers of paint, varnishes, as a diluent, and in mining. These years of rapidly expanding wood turpentine production from 1910 to 1950 matched the decades during which pine oil disinfectants and the pine aroma became widely associated with clean spaces. The products steadfastly contrasted their fresh-smelling scents to alternatives. As a 1922 advertisement for Pinetol noted, Pinetol destroys the germs that only the microscope can see without making the house smell like a hospital. Eli Lilly's Pinaceptol noted it's free from the disagreeable odor of coal tar disinfectants and imparts a fragrant pine odor to the sick room. McKesson and Roberts, makers of Pinetol, promised their product had the delightful odor of a pine forest. Clifton Chemical Company, whose ad you just saw, marketed its pine gloss cleaner by juxtaposing a gleaming shiny floor with a pencil sketch of green pine trees on a verdant hillside. And by 1953, Leonard Schwartz, the author of Sanitary Chemicals, a book about all the different kinds of ways in which chemicals were being used in cleaning products, noted a general public acceptance of a piney odor as a clean odor. Pine oil disinfectants evoked their woody origins through their scent, but their odor left few indications of the deforestation from which the products originated. Disinfectant manufacturers wanted their users to imagine themselves walking through forests, not among dead stumps. Wood turpentine production, though, benefited from southern forest destruction. Wood turpentine producers fed cut stumps to their extractors, as many as 500 to 1,000 tons of them per day. And each day's production required the stumps of about 50 acres of uncleared land to reach the factory. And so, although the scent of pine had come to be culturally accepted as that of cleanliness, its material underpinnings were anything but solid. Pine oil manufacture relied upon a steady supply of old-growth longleaf and slash pine wood, from which the oil could be extracted and made into cleaning products. But by 1961, a U.S. Forest Service publication, the Outlook for Naval Stores, noted that although about 73 million tons of old-growth longleaf and stump wood remained, only about 2/3 of that total was readily accessible. The rest was in too remote of locations to be extracted with bulldozers. So the report predicted that by 1981, the supply would be out. In fact, one stump remains in production today in Brunswick, Georgia, one of the first locations utilized for this purpose. But still, stump wood for pine oil extraction is a non-renewable resource, since, as one Florida forest economist explains, trees are generally not allowed to grow to the age when heartwood formation occurs, and it's that heartwood that is where the resinous pine oil resides. It only starts to develop after about 80 years. So pine oil's future banked on the forests of the past, not on living trees. Now, if by the 1960s the supply of stump wood was greatly diminished, the urgency behind cleaning up was diminished somewhat as well. Public health officials had prized pine oil disinfectants in the 1910s and 20s because the chemicals were effective against the germs of communicable disease bacteria, especially typhoid. But as sewage treatment and the ready availability of antibiotics lessened the fatal blows dealt by communicable disease, ridding a space of germs was only a matter of reducing exposure, not fending off death. Deodorizing the space came to be just as important once again as disinfecting. And so there were sort of three reasons why pine oil disinfectants emerged between the 1910s, late 1910s, and the 1950s, each of which was a different group's response to a perceived problem. First, public health officials saw pine oil disinfectants as a particularly good way to rid spaces of the germs of communicable diseases. Second, manufacturers viewed extraction of pine oil from cut stumps as a profit booster that would create incentives to clear land. And finally, and not insignificantly, consumers preferred the disinfectant's odor to that of competing products, making it synonymous with clean. As manufactured in the 1920s and 30s, it addressed all three problems. But by the 1950s and 60s, the piney odor had become pine oil disinfectant's key selling point. The problem of land clearing for agricultural conversion was less pressing. And consumers had little indication of the changing material underpinnings for pine oil, for the imagery and marketing of pine-scented products largely remained stable, even as the material sources were not. So fast forward to just a few years ago, in 2013, when the Clorox company, who now manufactures pine sol, altered the formula for its product. Pine oil was in short supply and especially expensive, so the company eliminated it from its formula. And loyal consumers reacted quickly, but not because they read the label carefully and knew what it contained. What alerted them was that the new pine sol smelled different than the piney product they knew and loved. Through petitions and Facebook comments, hundreds of consumers voiced their frustration, reminiscing about how the original scent reminded them of their mothers and their grandmothers, and they shared tips on which alternative cleaners still smelled like pine sol once did. Eventually, Clorox re-released the original scent for online sales only, but the elegies for a scent never translated into reflections about a forest felled. How is it the bottled essence of pine came to be more to people than the trees from which it came? Environmental history can serve an important function, not simply by recognizing how Americans came to know nature through their work, but also by revealing how their work obscured such ties. If one of the most important emphases in the latest decade or two of the field has been to reveal how work helped people know nature, so also is it worthwhile to learn the processes by which people came to ignore natural processes and effects on new technology of the natural world. And so as I work to document the processes of pine oil manufacture, I also hope to capture the processes by which consumers became ignorant of them. All right, I'm shifting here to a less good scent. And shifting our attention now to a different technology, a technology that is used only for a short period of time in a person's life, but yet has a significant environmental footprint. And that technology is Chucks, or as it was first marketed under Johnson & Johnson's name in 1936, the disposable diaper. Since their widespread adoption in the United States during the 1970s and 80s, they have become the primary way to keep infants dry and clean. And no product became more a symbol of the disposable culture, nor more a target of concerns about its environmental implications than the disposable diaper. Ultimately, concerns about their use crested in the 1990s, with growing concern about the size of the solid waste stream. But as a historian, I was as interested in the periods before that. Both in the temporal and geographic sense, I wanted to know more about the diaper's origins. When did people start using paper diapers, I wondered, and why? And geographically, as an environmental historian, I wanted to know more about production upstream. What kinds of trees became the pulp stuffing diapers, and where were those forests? As parents turned to diapers to contain babies' messes and stenches, how did pulp and paper manufacturers address the messes and stenches of the diapers' production? This process actually yielded more than I wanted to know. This chapter has mushroomed, and as I presented it a few weeks ago, many of the people wanted me to write an entire book about only diapers. I think the verdict is not out. I don't want to hear questions about diapers for the next 10 years. But I can tell you that from what I know right now, I can tell you that there's sort of 3 stages that are going to be important in this story. I'm only going to have time today to talk about 1 or 2 of them, but I'll leave the third for another occasion. You can come by office hours or talk to me then. First, between 1937 and 1967, paper diapers were available but not readily adopted. During this period, 3 factors thwarted their spread: consumers' preference for durability rather than disposability. Families devalued the time women spent washing diapers relative to the greater expense for single-use diapers. And finally, the supply chain for diaper manufacture was in its infancy. The period in which diapers were readily adopted is a period between about 1968 and 1985. Ironically, as I'll come back to, in a period of intense environmental consciousness. And then finally, in the late 1980s and early 1990s, environmental activists targeted the wastefulness of disposable diapers. These environmental challenges to disposable diapers failed. Activist efforts could not overcome advertising and lobbying heft of the leading diaper makers Procter & Gamble and Kimberly-Clark. And I argue in the longer paper that there were some tactical missteps, but we can talk more about that, as I said, on another occasion. So, just to remind you, if you haven't thought about this product as much as I have in the last 10 years, there's sort of 2 things to be thinking about here. Although I just divided this into some 3 neat phases, there's one thing that's unchanging, which is that babies make stinky messes, and they have to be taken care of in some way. And there's sort of 2 kinds of skills and 2 kinds of labor that are involved here, and this product was advertising their ease in both of them. One is the actual act of changing a baby itself, which, if you haven't done it for a while, requires a fair amount of skill, both in detecting whether or not the diaper is dirty and trying to remove and extricate a child without smearing things all over. And then there's the act of changing, keeping the baby entertained as you're doing it. So that involves a considerable amount of skill. There's somebody in the back I know that has an infant that can probably attest to this well. But the other step that's also an important laborsome part of this process that's going to play into our story is then, once all of that skillful work that only takes a few minutes is done, there's a more toilsome task, one that takes an even greater amount of time and is particularly burdensome, that of washing and sanitizing diapers. Diapers had to be washed separately from other laundry with greater frequency. Moreover, doing diaper laundry required additional steps, maybe soaking ahead to prevent or clean up stains, boiling for sanitation purposes, extra rinsing to ensure that no detergent remained on the diaper that could irritate baby's skin. Sheets, blankets, and baby clothing often also become soiled and wet, which add to the laundry burden. So there were a number of ways to address this task, and during this first phase, between 1937 and 1967, all 3 of them were in play, although one was done in much greater number. Slides again are a little bit out of order. One, in some places you could hire out the task. Starting in the late 1930s, diaper services flourished in a number of cities, employing a number of people that's not available in rural areas and often was beyond the cost that many could afford. A second was that, as I mentioned, in 1936, Chuck's diapers are initially introduced. But between the 1930s and 1960s, disposable diapers were thought to be an occasional purchase, appropriate for traveling and trips to the doctor, but not for everyday use. A 1948 ad for Chuck's, for instance, that you see here, features the line, "When we go bye-bye, mommy buys me Chuck's," and noted that the disposable was America's favorite vacation diaper for years and years. Another ad suggested parents use them on rainy days, underscoring the continued importance of hanging out laundry to dry. But the vast majority of parents relied instead on doing the laundry at home. It was considerably cheaper, while the cost of a washing machine with adequate capacity to wash diapers was an upfront cost. The cost of diapers and materials to cleanse them was half of that of hiring a service, and about a quarter to a fifth of the price of disposables. So cloth diapers were readily used in the period that we're discussing here, and there's sort of 3 key reasons that are important to think about. One is that people value diapers for their durability. They can go through many kids, be reused many times, and their versatility, that they could be used as a birth cloth as well as on a baby's bottom. And you can see this in some of the correspondence with one of the diaper innovators. Believe it or not, there's a whole class of these people that continue to be around. But one of them donated their papers to the Smithsonian so I could read them. So that's why I'm featuring Margaret O'Brien Donovan, who designed the Boater diaper cover. And it was a largely successful product. It sold out at Saks, high-end diaper cover. But as satisfied customers recommended the Boater to their friends, stores had trouble keeping them in stock. Even the most satisfied customers shared a common complaint. The covers fell apart too soon. As Mrs. F.P. Broswell wrote, "Within 3 weeks, the rubber had pulled off the nylon to such an extent it was useless." Another wrote, "My baby was born on Armistice Day. I started using the Boater shortly after. It didn't last till Christmas because the inside covering perforated." At a retail price nearly 4 times of the standard diaper cover, mothers expected a high-quality product. And customers were disappointed by the Boater's short-lived effectiveness. Their comments are less important for what they say about the Boater specifically than what they reveal about the common shared assumptions of American mothers in the 1950s. They expected diapers to be durable, not disposable. A second reason why diapers aren't readily developed, disposable diapers don't take off during this period, is also because the pulp and paper industry nationally is just beginning to flourish, particularly in the South. So all of those areas that had been cut over that you saw initially, some of them were replanted at agricultural use, but then of course during the 1930s there were lots of concerns about soil erosion and about the fate of rural economies in southern states. And so many southern states turned to pulpwood production as a way to perhaps stabilize these markets. And there are southern industrialists who are looking to the South newly for pulpwood supplies. And by the 1950s, about half of the nation's pulpwood comes from the South. But that federal and state level attention to growing pulpwood, oh, I think I moved my slides around before I came and I moved them around in the wrong way. All right, that federal attention to pulpwood really got a bigger incentive. First, in the New Deal, there were efforts to grow seedlings, but even more so by the 1956 Soil Bank program. So this was a federal program that was a soil conservation measure with the goal of taking land out of production to improve the farm economy, but it came with particular enticements to convert cropland for conservation purposes, including timber production. It provided landowners with 80% of the cost for planting trees and provided annual payments based on land values for the following 10 years. And so in the 1950s, the South sees a big surge in forest planting, one that far exceeded the increased tree planting from the New Deal. And that was the federal program that helped build the material underpinnings of the paper industry. It became available to paper mills in the 1970s and would provide the raw materials for low-cost paper production that undergird the throwaway economy. The same era that transformed the cotton belt to sun belt, in one historian's terms, was also the moment that the cotton belt became a pine belt. So, until the 1970s, well into the 1960s, the outlook for cloth diapers seemed largely positive. Curity brand diapers, manufactured by the Kendall Company, enjoyed the largest market share. And in 1961, their annual report said more diapers were sold than in any year in Kendall history. They anticipated continued good demographic boom, so they acquired new companies in North Carolina and throughout the South to produce cotton diapers well into the 1960s, up until 1964. So then we come to this phase, the phase that you see here. And as you can see, between 1970 and 1990, American families switched the way they diapered infants from using nearly 90% cloth in 1970 to nearly 90% using disposable diapers by 1990. The key decade of change was the 1970s, whereas 25% of households utilized disposable diapers in 1970, by 1980, over half of them did. And from my perspective as an environmental historian, when I first saw this timeline of market share, I approached it like a paradox. For what I think of the 1970s, I think of the 1970s as the time in which federal environmental laws strengthen, in which the popular environmental movement, in which people are marching for Earth Day in 1970. And how can it be that it's in this decade, wearing my environmental historian hat, that this product with a significant water and waste impact takes off? My friends in the room that are gender historians are saying, well, how could you be so dumb? But I did present, this research at the Environmental History Conference, and everybody in the room nodded like quizzically, like, yes, tell us. Well, first of all, I want to remind you what a paradox it is, and then I'll give you some of the punchline. So I want to remind you of the paradox that it is that part of the reason I thought this was so paradoxical was that one of the key kinds of industries that is targeted, for good reason, by environmental legislation in the early 1970s is the pulp and paper industry. Pulp and paper mills, required massive amounts of water for the manufacture of their product. In 1967, the pulp and paper mills used nearly 2.1 trillion gallons of water. And as it used water, it returned it to the streams with pollutants, like broken down fibers of wood pulp, wood sugars, pulping and bleaching chemicals. Wood sugars that expelled into the rivers fed bacteria, which reduced the amount of oxygen in the water for fish and wildlife in streams. And so on rivers with lots of pulp and paper mills, like Oregon's Willamette or Maine's Androscoggin, pulp mill waste accounted for 80 to 90% of the biological oxygen demands of the river. Nationally, the industry was responsible for 1/4 of the nation's industrial wastewater emissions. And so it's no surprise that the pulp and paper industry was at the center of many of the efforts to regulate industry. In 1972, when Congress passes the Clean Water Act and made the EPA the authority to set and uphold environmental standards, the act declared a goal of fishable and swimmable rivers by 1983 and the elimination of pollutant discharges by 1985. And this had clear implications for pulp mills that were supplying diaper manufacturers. Many of the plants that made fluff pulp, which is the stuff that stuffs diapers, were located in the South, and prior to the passage of the Clean Water Act, these states had lax environmental standards to encourage industrial development. And the history of the mill that provided fluff pulp for Procter & Gamble is a case in point. In 1947, to lure the Procter & Gamble subsidiary Buckeye Cellulose to the region, the municipal leaders of Perry, Florida, which is located just west of Tallahassee here. These are the pulp mills that are operating in the South, that are built there in the late 1960s and 70s, and that's where the Procter & Gamble mill is. Along the Fenn Holloway stream, the municipal leaders in Perry asked state legislators to enact legislation to declare the county an industrial county. And what this did was it specifically defined the Fenn Holloway River as a waste stream. So any manufacturing or industrial plant was empowered to discharge and deposit sewage, industrial and chemical waste and effluents, or any of them into the waters of the Fenn Holloway River and the waters of the Gulf of Mexico into which said river flows. What this designation meant was that the county's economic status outweighed and superseded any environmental or public health protections. It passed unanimously. In 1954, Buckeye Cellulose opened its mill, which was expanded in 1958, again in 1964. And by the late 1960s, this was the primary source for Procter & Gamble's pulp fluff for diapers. In the late 1960s, perhaps prompted by the passage of the Water Quality Act, Buckeye Cellulose did report some plant improvements. But since the Buckeye Cellulose mill used almost nearly all of the Fenn Holloway's flow, almost all the water downstream from the mill consisted of pulp mill effluent. And by the 1970s and 80s, when biologists dipped their nets into the Fenn Holloway, they found the malodorous stream revealed disturbing clues about the ecological costs of this unabated effluent. One experiment calculated the number of fish in the Fenn Holloway versus a neighboring stream, found that there were just 3 species of fish on the polluted waters of the Fenn Holloway. A nearby stream had 9 times as many. The Fenn Holloway boasted 1/4 of the aquatic invertebrates of its neighbor. And they concluded at this time that the Fenn Holloway River and its associated marshes were so contaminated by pulp mill waste that little in the way of free swimming forms of life have been able to survive. And it wasn't just the Fenn Holloway. As part of their strategy, and in some cases in part of their response to the environmental legislation that was being passed, it was easier for many companies to erect new pulp mills in southern states, even though there was now a federal standard, than it was to retrofit plants that were in existing areas like the Northeast or particularly in the Pacific Northwest. I don't have time to go into the details very much now, but it's worthwhile to study these water quality laws in the context of the disposable diaper for 2 reasons. First, the water pollution permits and scientific studies that were conducted help document the environmental consequences of the product's production. But just as importantly, the mill closures and greater efficiencies in pulp and paper manufacture serve as examples of the decline in manufacturing that took place in the 1970s. One congressional study found that between 1979 and 84, more than 11 million workers lost employment due to plant closings or relocation. And so in communities like Everett, Washington, which lost 3 mills during that period, families who lost jobs through plant closings and relocations often responded, and here's the punchline finally, by sending women into the paid labor force, increasing the likelihood that they would turn to time-saving technologies like disposable diapers. So, there's those slides about the soil bank program. Oh, that's an interesting one we'll get to in a minute. During the 1970s, American families became increasingly reliant on women's earning power to sustain family needs. By 1985, women's earnings accounted for 30 to 40% of family income on average, and women with very young children entered the workforce in record numbers. The number of working mothers of children under 3 steadily rose in the 1970s, from 26% in 1970 to 41.5% in 1980. If time pressures tilted the tables in favor of disposable diapers, the increasing use of daycare by working mothers also encouraged their use. Until the 70s, social norms had actually restricted and discouraged mothers from enrolling infants and toddlers in daycare centers. In some states, it was simply not permitted for children under 3 to be in daycare. But when infants and toddlers entered daycare settings, many of them changed from cloth to disposable diapers. Daycare licensing codes encouraged their use. While no state's licensing code specifically forbade cloth diapers, prior to 1978, regulations moved in that direction. Idaho's, for instance, suggested directly that disposables be used, but because of cost, this is not a requirement. Like daycares, hospital maternity wards introduced disposable diapers and implicitly endorsed them. Paper companies sought incorporation of single-use diapers in medical settings as a way to bolster the product's legitimacy and advertise their product to a key audience, parents of infants. So paper companies courted hospital administrators, not simply by advertising their cost-saving elements, but also by pitching their healthful benefits. And so they sponsor a number of different studies having to do with diaper dermatitis and other kinds of research. And they're adopted kind of alongside a lot of other disposable technologies, disposable syringes and needles, the introduction of paper sheets and those sorts of things, paper cups and napkins in employee cafeterias. So Pampers begins advertising in 1969. By 1971, Kimberly-Clark's emerge as well. And so over the course of this decade, as diapers are readily adopted, even as environmental laws are strengthening, there are starting to be visible ecological effects. Most of them focus on the solid waste stream. So the amount of solid waste produced per patient per day in a hospital, for instance, increases by 4 times of the average citizen over the course of the 1970s. And using disposables required many hospitals to try to figure out new ways of dealing with trash. But there's also problems that are happening in terms of the pulp supply. I'm sorry, these are out of order. As the South is beginning to suburbanize, the vast majority, 80% of the pulpwood in the South was coming from private landholders, not public lands. And so land prices were increasing, and the amount of wood supplying these pulp mills was starting to diminish. Weyerhaeuser, who produces one of the biggest fluff pulp producers in New Bern, North Carolina, is starting to introduce new strategies of scientifically breeding trees because they simply can't get enough transported from private landholders during that time, as people are going to rural areas in the South and moving there either because suburbanization is taking land out of production or simply because people are moving with a suburban idea and they want their forest for aesthetic purposes rather than seeing it as an economic use. And so what's inside the diaper is actually changing. Weyerhaeuser is writing to its engineers saying that they're getting more and more juvenile wood. How are they going to make up for pulp? And they start to do a variety of different kinds of experiments. I don't know exactly what is going on in this particular image, but it's the diaper testing lab at the Weyerhaeuser Paper Company in the 1980s. Over here, I don't know if you can see, but it says Diaper Test Control Center. And these are fluid discharge going in and out. It's an intriguing image that I found in the Weyerhaeuser records. I'm not sure what to make of it, but it's certainly fascinating. I'm not going to tell you the end of the diaper story, as I mentioned before, but I do want to provide you with some conclusions. So what's innovative here in what I've told you is probably not so much the history of forests or of daycares that I told separately. Those have been told one by one, but my juxtaposition of these stories side by side. Usually forest history researchers tell the first part of this tale, social and gender historians the latter. And so what's the utility of telling these stories together as a single story? Well, first, explaining the diaper in context of production of pulp and paper is important because it provides a more comprehensive sense of the environmental costs of a disposable society. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, when disposable diaper became the target of environmental activism, nearly all the discussion of environmental comparisons between cloth and paper diapers focused on post-consumer waste. Most of the efforts to regulate disposable diapers were generated by localities and states who had greater authority over waste disposal, and that's partly why. But the effect of this focus on post-consumer waste was that it neglected to give a full accounting of the environmental effects of both cloth and paper diapers, for it did not track the components of either diaper from its source, nor did it account for disproportionate pollution burdens that paper companies imposed on communities in close proximity to paper mills. Second, providing a better sense of the context in which diapers became adopted provides a deeper understanding of how resource-intensive practices and products become enmeshed in everyday life. Too often, I feel environmental scholars treat the consumer as a trigger whose behavior at the point of sale sets into motion a cascade of environmental consequences. But this perspective lacks attention to what caused the consumer to pull the trigger. Business leaders, on the other hand, construe sales numbers as endorsements by a broader public of their values. But learning more about the historic context in which people use products, even when countered to their values, reveals the fallacies of this approach. And so taking consumption seriously requires thinking about consumers beyond simply the point of sale, and considering how they came to particular goods and what meanings they made of them in their own lives. And finally, and most importantly, telling these stories together, I hope, begins to expose how Americans made trade-offs between exploitative relations of labor and exploitative relations to nature. To fully capture why and how consumer products with large environmental effects took hold, historians need to think about women's work both inside and outside the home. The effective use of reusable and durable cloth diapers rested on a time-intensive process of washing them, carried out either unpaid by women in the home or by low-paid laundry workers. To purchase a paper diaper was, in effect, to buy time. As more of women's work began to carry remunerative benefits, that time became more and more valuable. And that context of women's time was fundamental to the appeal of disposable products and yet rarely gets some of the attention it deserves. As the literature on work and environmental history swells, little of it has dwelled on the context in which women labored, the home, the textile plant, and the nursing ward. Yet women's actions as workers carried broad ramifications for the environment, not simply through the knowledge they gained of nature through their work, but through the way it changed the calculus of time well spent. In a world that requires parents to make tough choices about how to spend their time and money, it's not surprising that many parents seek out technologies to achieve a relative standard of care without a large time commitment. Economic and social policy provide greater monetary rewards for work performed outside the home than within it, and value cleanup and care work least of all. These hard truths cannot be left out of the story of intensifying resource use, for they are at the heart of the trade-off that creates more work for nature. Thank you.